Okay, so this is a study guide for Stuart Hall's Encoding Decoding Model of Communication and how Hall looked at ideology and hegemony. So, Hall was influenced by Roland Barthes and his work on myths and how the myths contain ideological meanings. So, for Barthes, myth and ideology in, in the structuralist sense are synonymous. Barth believed that, for instance, the ideology of a French colonialism is expounded in the proud salute of a black soldier, which is a famous example that he gave. Um, it's not only in deconstructing the myth or reading what's behind the myth um, that its ideology, the values and the beliefs that it upholds, can be exposed. So he believes or believed that, you know, by deconstructing a myth, you could find the hidden meanings behind the myth, the values and the beliefs that the myth upholds would be exposed. So the concept of ideology, the values and beliefs, have been theorized to a great extent by Marxists who followed Barthes, like Louis Althusser and Stuart Hall. Now, Althusser, when he looked at what he called um, ideological state apparatuses, he argued that individuals in capitalist societies are governed by these ideological state apparatuses. And these would be something like schools, legal systems, religious institutions, churches, the media, communications apparatus, and so on. And so these ideological state apparatuses espouse ideologies of powerful political institutions like the government and the armed forces in implicit ways, not explicit ways. They're not going to hammer you over the head, so to speak, but it would be something much more subtle. And sometimes we don't even realize that it happens, according to Althusser. And in this case, individuals, sort of internalize the capitalist ideologies, according to Althusser, and they're unaware that their lives are being repressed by these institutions, um, and that represent and serve them, and maybe even they work for them. So, what Hall notes is that Althusser's approach was more sophisticated than, the sort of classical Marxist notion of the top-down false consciousness model, which suggested that ideology is imposed from up on high by elite powers upon these sort of amorphous masses. And, we can go back to Adorno for this sort of classical Marxist model. Ideological state apparatuses point to a more, sort of linguistic, more discursive conception of ideology that's reproduced by, these various institutional practices and structures. Um, Alice Cashmore looked at Althusser's theory of ideological state apparatuses and applied it to television and suggested that viewers are given this sort of partial view of the world that fits with state interests, even when television is not explicitly state controlled, that supposedly it's privately controlled. But we know that, it sort of spans the spectrum, the ownership model. So, along with Althusser's ideas, we can apply that are applied. These ideas can, although Althusser's ideas can be applied to the media, the ideas that Hall puts forth rework the structuralist theories of ideology into something that's more systematic, a more systematic theory of media in their social and cultural functions. So Hall criticized Althusser for assuming that ideology, although it's internalized, always functions to reproduce, the state capitalist values. In how he says, how does one account for subversion? How does one account for those ideas that bring forth ideological struggle? And so, in this way, he defined ideology in sort of a discursive way, um, as ideas, meanings, conceptions, theories, beliefs, and that sort of thing, and the form of consciousness which are appropriate to them. So, Hall, along with some of the other theorists who were associated with the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, like Dick Hedbridge and David Morley, looked at the relationship between the media and ideology, through what they felt was necessary, which is to say that they looked at it through a semiotic analysis of systems of signification in text, like the television news bulletins, which was something that Hall looked at in great depth across the literature that he produced. Hall's aim here was to sort of rediscover ideology as a concept that can reveal the politics of signification that's engaged in by the media institutions. And so the way that he started off was to attack the behaviorist theories of the media, the models of effects, like what was put forth by Laswell's formula that theorized that the communication process in terms of its reliability. So, if the messages are not received as they're intended to be received, this is deemed to be, a failure of communication in a technical or behavioral sense. According to the effects perspective, the messages are not received correctly if the channels of communication from the sender to the recipient are distorted by human error or electrical malfunction. The meanings of the messages themselves, however, in behaviorism are assumed to be distortion free and um, universally accepted. So, or universally transferable. So it would all be the same. It would all flow one way. And if it didn't, there was some kind of error or something, some kind of um, aberration. But what Hall argued was that behavioral models are flawed because they fail to situate the media communications within existing social, economic, and political structures. The meaning of the messages, he contended, are able to be distorted and interpreted differently than intended according to the positions of the senders or the producers or the senders and those of the audience who are the recipients within these existing structures. So what he said was that meaning was a social production, that it's a practice, that the world has to be made to mean, that language and symbolization is the means by which meaning is produced. This approach, according to Hall, dethroned what he called the referential notion of language, which had sustained previous content analysis, according to Hall, where the meaning of a particular term or sentence could be validated simply by looking at what was in the real world, how it was looked at in the real world, how it was referenced in the real world. Now, content analysis is, the favored method of cultivation theory. According to Hall, this is rendered meaningless by this sort of structuralist perspective on meaning as a social production. So, like Saussure and Barthes, Hall stated that meaning is a discursive process that operates within a language system, what he termed a set of codes that are loaded, uh, filled with ideological signification. So, media institutions and the content that they generate and put out are important ideological dimensions through which we make sense of the world, according to Hall. So, Hall deployed semiotics to be able to understand what he called the sense-making process by which media transmit messages to their audiences. And in this way, language is encoding. It's made to mean something by those with the means of meaning production, like producers, and is then decoded, made to mean something, by audiences. Hall extends this theory, the semiotic theory of meaning construction, to a model of media production and reception that we call now the encoding decoding model of communication. So, unlike the behaviorist approach to communication, Hall's model, the encoding decoding model approach, does not assume that there's going to be a direct correspondence between the meaning that's intended by the sender and how that meaning is interpreted by a recipient. The codes that are embedded within the encoding and decoding may not be perfectly symmetrical. So Hall is interested in how media represent and indeed misrepresent what they mean rather than simply just reflect those meanings to the audiences. And while encoding and decoding are separate processes, they are not arbitrary. Encoding at the phase of production operates, within a set of journalistic or professional codes, he called it, like technical know-how and competence and, production values that are inherent in that operation. These professional codes generate what he termed preferred meanings that have what he called the institutional political ideological order imprinted in them, and that they have themselves become institutionalized. So television is the medium that Hall mostly studied. Um, in Britain, for example, he looked, you could look at, say, BBC operating with its sort of professional code that's in line with what they term their mission of public service. To a lesser extent, we could look at PBS like that, but not exactly. One characteristic of this sort of mode of public service or code of public service relates to, what they deem political impartiality. The BBC supposedly does not take sides in the, political parties. Otherwise, it would be breaking that code and being, very unprofessional and unsatisfactory according to journalistic codes. So this preferred meaning that's encoded by BBC news channels therefore includes political impartiality. The assumption is that the audience will not decode um, partiality, political points of view. Uh, if, as seemed likely, they adopt the BBC's preferred meanings in their news broadcasts. And like I said, we could certainly extrapolate that to here, where you have the mainstream media and the conservative or the liberal perspective on mainstream media. Certainly, like I said, we could sort of extrapolate that to the PBS back in the time before it accepted corporate sponsorship, particularly where it supposedly had this sort of BBC model. And yet, there were many people who, on the right, who felt that it did it because, for one reason or another, some was not very valid, but um, they felt that because it didn't, say, put on religious themed programs, or to them they disagreed with the interpretation of particular offerings of PBS, that they did not accept this sort of impartial, politically neutral point of view. So Hall argues that these preferred meanings have considerable weight when you're determining how messages are decoded. He says that they are not determinate. This sort of goes back to something that's important, which is the theory of structuralism that informs the encoding decoding model. So, in a determinate moment, um, the structure employs this sort of codes and sends out a message. At another determinate moment, the message coming through in its decoding stage, issues, into the structure of social practice. Now, for Hall, it's precisely because encoding and decoding are distinct, determinate moments that explains why the meaning structures of media messages don't always, and in fact quite often, don't reflect reality in an objective sense. So rather, so in the case of, say, television, messages can only be signified within the audiovisual forms of television discourse, according to Hall. A news event, like, say, like an inauguration, for instance, um, can't represent the experience of actually being there at the inauguration. It can only sort of like give a signification of that experience, of how that experience is truly like, through the sort of what he all called meaning structures, the rules, the conventions of the television message. So media, like language, are therefore structured through these sets of codes, rules, and values that make them highly prone to ideological construction of meaning, or what Barthes referred to as myths. So television is a primary myth maker. It constructs ideology, according to Hall. Like I said, it was his primary communication mode that he dealt with at the time. Processes, that include stuff like editing and selecting, various clips and camera operation and, zooming in and zooming out, various types of camera techniques and arrangements are all important aspects in the encoding process. And in the sense that it determines what the preferred meaning will be. So, like you have news bulletins, um, um, that are loaded with ideology of professionalism. What news stories are selected, how the news stories are edited, who's reading it, how they are reading it, how they arrange the stories in a particular order, what are the breaking stories as opposed to the fluff stories, or what's deemed fluff as opposed to breaking, are just, some of the many ways in which ideology the ideology of media professionals is constructed. The ideologies, particularly of newsworthiness, do not correspond to an objective set of criteria. On the contrary, what is deemed newsworthy is highly subjective oftentimes, and it differs from institution to institution, from country to country. Nonetheless, wherever the newsworthiness is practiced, whether it's on CNN, whether it's on the BBC, or whether it's on the broadcast networks, Al Jazeera, and those kinds of things, it exerts preferred meanings on the audience. So, um, moving forward, encoded messages or encoded ideologies, such as media professionalism, media newsworthiness, however, don't determine the meaning structures at the reception phase, the audience reception phase. And so, in this phase, Hall identified three categories of decoding, uh, through which audiences make meaning of media messages. And of course they're well known. The first, and and in keeping with the professional code, an audience member may completely accept the dominant code. They accept the preferred meanings that is intended by the encoders, the media producers. So, they'll accept it for what it is. A second possibility is that the audience adopts, sort of a negotiated uh, code, which, where they accept some of the message, some of the preferred message of the media producers, but they oppose others. Until, Hall felt that on a general level, the encoded meanings may be understood and endorsed, but, on a more specific level, local level meanings and the rules within which they operate may be discarded because audience members will consider their own positions to be exceptions to the general rule. So, for instance, um, a parent may adopt a negotiated code when decoding a television show about how to care for babies. So the parent may generally agree this is the way you take care of a baby when it's crying. But, because of the sort of idiosyncrasies about their own baby, they will sort of negotiate that and come up with, a little bit of that and a little bit of what their experience has shown, the baby's own idiosyncrasies. So finally, there's the audience member. The audience member may completely disagree with the preferred meaning of the media producers, both on a general and a local level. In which case, the audience member would adopt an oppositional stance, what Hall called an oppositional code, and decode the message completely in a contrary way. For example, a news story may be encoded with the ideological message that youth are becoming very troublesome and they're antisocial than previous generations of younger people. So an oppositional code is adopted at the moment when that message is decoded for an audience member by someone who has a historical knowledge of how young people have committed crimes and been stigmatized by societies, including the mass media, since forever. So, Hall's encoding decoding model was an attempt to rediscover and rescue ideology from this conception that messages, as they are produced, are omnipotent, oppressive forces that wield the media wields this sort of oppressive force on on the masses by the ruling class, as is occurs during the classical Marxist tradition of political economy theory. Um, but in a later work, he refers to what he calls the problem of ideology. Um, can it still withstand application in contemporary democratic societies where media institutions appear to be free from the power of states and commercial forces? And he acknowledges that Marxist theories of ideology tend to overemphasize negative and distorted features of, the capitalist ideas and values. But nevertheless, he remained sympathetic to Marx's original formulation of ideology, and particularly to the related concept of hegemony that was formulated by Antonio Gramsci. Okay, so unlike many Marxist conceptions of ideology, like Adorno, Marx didn't suggest that ideology amounts to this sort of mass deception, but rather to a situation where individuals who live in capitalist societies can only gain a sort of limited impression of the consequences of that capitalist system, given the ideological constraints that were imposed upon the masses by the ruling power elites. And so, one of the best revisions of Marx's ideas, Hall found was, you know, by Gramsci, who contended that in particular historical situations, ideas organize human masses and create the terrain on which men, according to Gramsci, move, acquire consciousness of their position and struggle. So social, economic, and political ideas create, according to Hall, a struggle, and an ideological struggle is part of the general social struggle for mastery of leadership, in short, for hegemony. So Gramsci's theory of hegemony, sort of marks a fundamental shift from this sort of orthodox structuralism to this more discursive form of post-structuralism, with which Hall, among others, um, including Foucault, has identified hegemony, unlike orthodox approaches to myth and ideology, is about a dialogue between those parts of a society with and without the power to signify their values and intentions. So, we can look at hegemony and understand it um, as an approach that could be used to demonstrate how media institutions can be articulated to the production and reproduction of these sorts of dominant ideologies, but at the same time be free of direct compulsion and independent of any direct attempt by the powerful to nobble them. So, in other words, hegemony is a give and take form of power. Hegemony works to, allow, this sort of dissenting voices in oppositional politics, but to suppress the force of dissent and opposition by actively seeking out support from all parts of society. So the media are argued, Hall argues that the media encode their products in the interest of dominant hegemonic forces like the government. And so the professional code that operates within the hegemony of the dominant code. So even if media institutions don't intend to collude with the forces of hegemony that operate in their countries or their regions, they're likely to do so unwittingly because hegemony, unlike more orthodox versions of ideology, is a function of existing social structures and practices, not an intentional, not an intention of individual. And unlike behaviorists like Katz and Lazarsfeld, who said that media have no direct effects other than to reflect the consensus opinion among people, Gramsci and Hall argued that the media, in their propensity to serve a hegemonic function for the good of those in power, effectively manufacture consent. And that sort of leads us to, um, you know, Herman and Chomsky's model of political economy approach to hegemony.